Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. Are we enjoying World War II weekend this year? Yes. I'm glad our rain was overnight and not today. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. My name is Dan Vermelia. I have the honor of working here at Eisenhower National Historic Site as a park ranger. We have a tremendous staff and team here with the National Park Service that has made this weekend possible. There are, by my last count, 20 different agencies, organizations, partner groups, museums participating in this, and that's not counting our living history groups. So this is a community effort, it's a team effort, and I think that in and of itself a tribute to Ike and the Allied effort 80 years ago in 1944. We've had, yeah, absolutely. We've had a tremendous weekend here, lots of great programming. The camp is still open until 3 o'clock, so after our program here, if you would like to join our last Ranger Guided Camp Walk at 2, feel free to go and do that. We still have some great programming going on, but we're honored to have our final speaker's presentation of the weekend. We began Friday evening with our friend Henry Sledge, who is somewhere around here. Hey, Henry. Talking about his father, Eugene Sledge, and his service in the Pacific Theater of the Second World War. And we're wrapping up our weekend with our friend, Mr. John Orloff, who's joining us here to talk about his work. Yeah, absolutely. His work translating the stories of the Second World War. And this is perfectly timed, by the way. Consider this part of your applause,
My
right?
car is here, I've got to go.
Yeah.
My ride.
Consider that part of your applause. It's a tribute. They're big fans of the show.
Ah, good.
So, big fans of the show. Well, John, I want to give you a formal introduction here. John is an acclaimed American screenwriter known for creating and adapting complex stories and widely disparate genres. He was nominated for an Emmy Award for his writing in HBO's Band of Brothers, as well as an Independent Spirit Award for his screenplay A Mighty Heart, the Michael Winterbottom film based on the kidnapping and death of reporter Daniel Pearl. He spent much of the last decade researching, creating, writing, and producing Masters of the Air, which debuted earlier this year on Apple TV+, an epic 9-part miniseries executive produced by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, chronicling the 100th Bomb Group's honesty in the European theater of World War II. The show stars Oscar nominees Austin Butler, Barry Keoghan, and Callum Turner. John is fourth-generation Hollywood, grew up in Los Angeles, but now he lives by a river in the Berkshire Mountains with bears and everything, right,
Yep,
John?
Yeah, definitely with bears.
Yeah.
My car was destroyed by a bear about 4 months ago.
I mean, destroyed.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. Thanks for being here.
I am thrilled to be here.
Well, let's start off our conversation. We're going to have a chance to get some broader questions here, but let's start off our conversation by fourth-generation Hollywood screenwriter. Why World War II? What draws you to this subject matter in your work?
Well, I grew up obsessed with World War II in the 70s. I loved World War II movies, Guns of Navarone. I mean, you could just go on Patton.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of grew up on that entertainment. And I was also sort of a latchkey kid. My parents were divorced. And when I was a kid, me and my friends would play Army, and we would get World War II Army surplus stuff. And, then I'd watch World War II TV shows, because that's what you did in the 70s. So I really grew up with World War II sort of ingrained in me, even though I have no relatives that I know of that served during the war. My father's Korean generation, the Korea conflict. So I was just obsessed with it, and always have been, quite frankly.
Yeah. So this show that took 10 years to produce and create, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of this series and maybe the start of that process?
Sure. Yeah. So I was a little World War II'd out after Band of Brothers. These are really intense projects, very emotional, and it's one of the reasons why I didn't partake in the Pacific. I was just needing a time out from all of that, because there's an enormous responsibility when you do one of these shows. It's not just like any other show. I mean, it ended up consuming 10 years of my life, Masters of the Air.
Yeah.
And I mean really consuming my life. So I sort of stepped away from World War II, and then around 2013, I think, Tom Hanks called me up and asked me if I wanted to do another one about the air war. And again, I was like a little hesitant, but I read the book, and at that point, Tom had sort of said he only wanted me to write an episode or two, so I was all in for that.
Yeah.
And slowly it just turned into 10 years of my life.
Yeah. So it goes from 1 episode to
10. Even
yeah.
though we ended up doing 9 episodes,
Right.
but we wrote 10.
And you told me in our first conversation a while back, I think back when the show was airing, we talked for the first time. You said this was the hardest thing that any of you had ever done. And obviously, because of the nature of what this is, you know, you have to get it right. But tell us a little bit more about what some of those challenges were that made it such a hard process.
Well, the scale of it. You know, from day one, when one of the reasons I wanted to do the project, I can't speak for other people, was the air war has never really been shown incredibly accurately in film. I mean, it's been, you know, I mean, 12 O'Clock High is a great film, The War Lover is a great film, Memphis Belle is a great film, but technically you couldn't show what it was really like up there in those films. You know, you didn't, you know, 12 O'Clock High is, the combat sequences have real footage, right? And it's, real footage is actually not great to tell stories. And it actually, we get into really complicated camera stuff, but that's not really what a battle looked like, how it is in 12 O'Clock High. It's much more accurate in Masters. But so that was the first thing. Like when we had made Band and when they had continued with Pacific, we'd seen good films, you know, about infantry and the Marines. And so while both Band and the Pacific were incredibly new and deeply thought out and all of those things, it was still something that audiences were pretty familiar with. Masters was all about scale and scope. In some ways the opposite of Band or the Pacific, which are very tightly focused, you know. Masters is not tightly focused, and the image that was always driving me was 1,000 airplanes in the air.
Yeah.
Right? That was the thing that was like, okay, nobody's seen that since 1945.
Yeah.
You know, nobody's even tried to do it in a movie. And so that then, so making a show about 1,000 airplanes in the air is very fucking complicated. It's very complicated, especially if no B-17s really fly anymore. Yeah, there's a few, but they're not going to let us fly them. And so technically, it was just a horse of a different color from Band or the Pacific. We had as many special effects shots in Masters of the Air. We had more special effects shots in Masters of the Air than they did in the Avatar movie.
Oh, wow.
Basically, so that makes things infinitely more complicated.
Yeah.
You know, air made it, everything was more complicated.
I think I'd seen an interview you did around when the show debuted, and you mentioned that these are things people haven't seen in combat since 1944 and 45, and in those early episodes you're seeing views of planes flying by and at the speed. It's stunning, the visuals of this. Let's talk about the focus of the show for a minute. Band of Brothers follows Easy Company, 101st Airborne. The Pacific follows 3 stories through the Pacific Theater of Marines. I know Don Miller's book is the title of source of the title of the series, but why the 100th Bomb Group? How did that stand out?
So the story is Steven Spielberg read Masters of the Air and called up Tom Hanks and said, this should be the next one. I think we should do a show about Buck and Bucky, these 2 guys, who are Egan and Clevin in the show. And it's around 40 or 50 pages of the book, Masters of the Air, is about the 100th Bomber Group. It's an overview. I don't know how many have read it, but it's an overview of the 8th Army Air Force's battle against Germany. But the whole 8th Army Air Force, not one little group. So it talks about a whole... Eisenhower is mentioned more in the book than Clevin or Egan. You know, the book is not about Clevin or Egan. So my first task was to try to figure out how to make a show around Clevin and Egan. And there's no biographies of them, there's no books about them, there's no anything other than this Masters of the Air. And so that required about a year of research, figuring out what these two guys did in the course of their tour of duty. And in that process, I mean, obviously, Rosie, Robert Rosenthal, and Crosby are mentioned in the book. Rosenthal more, but Crosby became really important from a narrative standpoint when I realized. So here's the narrative problem, the difficulty with Masters of the Air. Our two main characters are shot down. No, spoiler alert. Shot down, and then they go into the POW camp, and now nobody knows them that's left at the 100th Bomber Group. They've all been shot down. When Clevin and Egan go down, that's 34 of the original 36 B-17s are down in 12 weeks. So now I have a whole new cast of characters at Thorpe Abbott's that don't know Buck and Bucky. So Crosby is the only guy who arrived in May of '43, flew a B-17, and was still there on VE Day. So that suddenly he became a main character because he was the through line between the two eras of the first era, the early guys, Buck and Bucky, and then the second era of the 100th is sort of dominated by Robert Rosenthal, because he really was sort of a la Dick Winters, a really unique individual, a really special human being. And so Rosie's story was just as important, but it would come out of left field because Rosie arrives, I think, 3 weeks before Egan goes down. So they're not friends. They don't have a relationship, you know? So once I figured out those were my four main characters, then I was kind of off to the races.
Well, and Crosby, who is a navigator, serves almost as this navigating voice in the series, right? It's another. I guess there's going to be a lot of spoilers today, but yeah, he's narrating certain things for us and guiding us through. How much did his memoir, Wing and a Prayer, help you as well?
Hugely.
Yeah.
That was a key thing that I read, and I was like, oh, okay, now I understand how I can make this work. Yeah, his book is really good, by the way. He's a really good writer. He had gone, one of the interesting things about the 8th Army Air Force, as opposed to Band of Brothers and the Airborne, is the officers, the flight officers, tended to be college educated by necessity because there was so much math involved in flying an airplane. And as a result, they tended to be more intelligent and better spoken. And so Crosby, in fact, I think after the war he got his, no, I think he was trying to get his master's in, right? Wasn't he trying? I can't remember whether he got his master's in creative writing before or after the war. Probably after the war. But he was a writer. He was a professional writer. And he was a great writer, and it's a great book, and it really was helpful.
Well, I'm curious, you know, with your work on Band of Brothers, you were working on that with veterans still alive.
Very different process.
You got to know some of those veterans quite well, right?
Yes, yeah.
Including Dick Winters.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. This is now much later on. How does that change the process with the veterans not being there?
Everything. It changed everything. You know, when we had, you know, you could call up Dick Winters and say, okay, well, what did you feel when this happened? Or tell me more about this thing. And he would tell you. You know, I obviously, pretty much all of our main characters have passed in the 100th Bomber Group. I could talk to a couple of pilots and crew members, but they weren't like the the guys I was writing about. And that's very different because everybody has their own experiences, and but it was harder. I mean, it was a lot harder to not be able to have those guys at hand.
Did you find of those four main characters, Clevin, Egan, Rosenthal, and Crosby, did you find one that you were most drawn to, or maybe felt that you related to the most?
I was really attracted to Egan. I don't know why. And Egan, I sort of felt was the most like me, and he's probably more in the show than he would be because I love him a lot.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, that was the character I sort of really. I mean, Rosie, to me, Rosenthal is sort of like Dick Winters. They're almost unapproachable. They're so heroic. Mm-hmm. They're so I can't compare myself to them. You know, they're just on a different plane.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, I'm curious if there's a scene in the show. We'll talk more about some of the historic aspects of the air war here in a moment. But was there a scene in the show that you think that in the final version that aired came out just exactly the way you envisioned it, or is it as close to? Is there one scene in particular that you think is exactly how you want it?
Yeah, I mean, listen, being a writer is a very difficult thing because I'm not the boss, right? Like, I have a lot of say in what happens, what you see on screen, but I'm not the total boss, right? So, and we had hired these really talented directors who were film directors, and they had their own ideas about how they would want to do things, and so we had to incorporate their ideas. You know, it's a collaborative medium, so not everything is how I want it, but that's normal. I think my favorite battle in the show is episode 5, the Munster battle, where Rosie, where they can only get 13 planes up and 12 are shot down, and Rosie is the only guy to come back. And imagine, this is his third mission in 3 days. So mission 1 is the mission that Clevin goes down on in Bremen on October 8th, I think. And they had, I think, like 27 planes and 10 get shot down. Those aren't exact numbers. And then the next mission is a Sunday, I think, the 9th. It's a milk run for Rosie, so everybody comes home. And then his third day is Munster. So the first day they've lost like 10 planes. The third day they lose 12 out of 13 planes. That's his first 3 days.
Yeah.
Now each one of those planes has 10 guys on it. So in his first 3 days, more than 200 guys have gone down. You know? And he's the only plane to come back. And it all happened like we showed it. Everything. Even him outwitting the people. So the tech guy. So we hired all these technicians, right? Like every expert that ever lived about a B-17. And we had this one guy, nice guy. He flew B-17s as a reenactor in California. And he read the script for 5, and he's like, "You can't do that in a B-17. That never happened. You can't shoot that." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And we got into a very serious argument. I mean, like, almost getting really physical. I was like, and I finally just said, "Maybe you can't do that in a B-17. But Rosie did."
Yeah.
And here you can look at the after report.
And that's him flying it like a fighter pilot.
Correct.
Maneuvering around to get
Correct, and he did that. At least he says he did it, and I'm not going to call him a liar.
Yeah.
You know, he did those maneuvers. And the reason was, this is the thing, he wasn't just some guy who showed up and started to fly an airplane. He had spent most of 1942-43 as a pilot of a B-17 in Texas, where he would take gunners up, and it would be gunnery training. So he'd be in Texas, they'd be flying like a target behind them, and gunning crews would practice target. But what that meant was he had flown a B-17 for like 9 months, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, before he ever got to England. And so when he got there, he just knew how to fly a plane. Yeah. He knew how to fly a B-17.
Well, and I think one of the beautiful things about shows like this is it takes these real people who are heroic in many ways, and it makes them relatable to us, and it reminds us of their humanity. So we're talking a lot about Rosie. So let's focus on him here for a moment.
Yeah.
He ends up flying 52 missions.
52 missions.
And then after the war,
he's shot down 3 times.
shot down 3 times. And after the war, he is a prosecutor with the Nuremberg trials.
Right.
That's a record of service that is hard for so many of us to relate to, but he's a human, and and one of the humanizing elements for him is the way that music is included with him. Is that something that he really was?
Yep. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Really into jazz and big band, way into dancing. He really loved music. He was an athlete. He was a star athlete. He became a lawyer before the war, like just weeks before Pearl Harbor. He had graduated that, I guess, spring, law school. He was a really amazing individual. And the thing about the Nuremberg thing that I always find really interesting is, and there's a line in the show that sort of hints at it, the job wasn't done. He wasn't going to go home till the job was done. And the Nuremberg trials was the final part of getting the job done.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit more about translating such complex stories to a television show with dramatic narratives and all that. When you're doing research on something like this, there's Don Miller's book, there's Harry Crosby's memoir. What are other sources you found that were so useful, like missing aircrew reports?
Oh,
all
yeah,
that kind
absolutely,
of stuff.
all that stuff. Well, one of the things that's great about the Air Force was they took notes on everything. So if you see it in the show, this is how it would go. After a mission, the first thing they would do is go to the interrogation hut, where they would give an after-mission debriefing, so they could tell everybody what went wrong. Right? Why are we suffering so many losses? Why are so many planes going down? What can we do to fix it on the next mission? Well, we can only do that by figuring out what went wrong on the last mission. So all that paperwork still exists. So I could go into a mission, see who was on every plane, what the formation was, what happened during the mission. You know, one of the things that I decided very early on was, in those battles, every plane you see is a real, I mean, it's a special effect, but it's a real plane in history. We didn't just put, Austin Butler, sexy guy in a, pilot cap and put him in a plane and then just put other planes next to him. No, every single plane, we know who's in those planes in the battles. Every single battle, every plane you see go down, it's probably going down historically accurately, even though you don't even know who's on it. We do. And so if a plane goes down in the after-mission report because engine number 1 and 3 went off and that's what made it go down, that's what happens in the show. Even planes that you barely know.
Yeah.
But we could only do that because the after-mission reports existed. With On Band of Brothers, they didn't have after-mission reports like that. So it was just asking Dick Winters or Gardner what happened. Yeah. Here, I didn't have to do that.
Well, and the show also captures what life was like between missions, I think, quite well for these airmen. Did you visit Thorpe Abbotts?
Yeah, I did visit Thorpe Abbotts in East Anglia. And that was obviously another really interesting difference between Band of Brothers, the Pacific, versus Masters, which is, in the Pacific and Band, those guys were in theater for, weeks and weeks and weeks, leading very difficult lives. The weird thing about being an airman was you would get in your airplane, you'd go on a 6 or 8 hour terrifying mission, and then you'd come home and you could go to the bar, you could get a drink, you could go find a girl, you could have a nice 3 days before you had to fly again. So they had this sort of like rubber banding of terror. Oh, now we're going to go to the pub. Terror. Very different than being in field.
Well, and I think it's in Don Miller's book, and I've read it elsewhere, that had a unique kind of psychological toll on them as compared to, if you're in frontline combat day after day after day, you're not going out of that and into some comfortable environment. It's the jarring juxtaposition of the two.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And then you add on top of that, by mid 1943. So what just timeline, obviously Pearl Harbor, 1941, 1942, we're building, we start the war with less than 200 B-17s. We have less than 200, the entire Air Force, Army, it wasn't even the Air Force then, the Army Air Corps, less than 200 B-17s. By the end of the war, we build 13,000, I think, 13,000 B-17s, 12,000 and change, and then another like 14,000 B-26. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And then in 42, so 41 we have 200 B-17s, 42 we start sending small air crews over to England, and they're just getting their butts kicked. And then in 43, they're still getting their butts kicked. And the 100th arrives in May of 43. That's when the show starts. And at that point in the war, the life expectancy was 7 missions. And they knew it. So you know it. So you wake up on your 6th mission, then you wake up, 3 days later on your 7th mission. You go up, you come back, and you're now on borrowed time. And you've got, how many more? 18 more?
Yeah.
18 more missions you have to fly on borrowed time. And they all knew that.
Yeah.
They knew they were probably going to die.
Which I think leads to, is at the heart of the show, is why do they keep getting back in the plane, right? Like, what do you think? I mean, it's an individual answer for everybody,
It
right?
is. I can't answer it,
Yeah,
because it is kind of unimaginable.
Yeah, and it's I think one of the things about it is it's each other, it's their belief in what they're fighting for. Everybody has their own, whether it's friendship or whatnot, with Egan coming back and wanting to get back in the plane because they just
All
shot
true.
his buddy down.
All true.
Everybody has, and I think that's a very real part of it from the lived experiences of these veterans.
Yeah, and I mean, I think any sort of band of brothers, anybody in combat, there is that foxhole sort of relationship that is sacred and is the reason you get up and fight. It's not for your country necessarily, but for the guy in the foxhole with you.
Yeah. Well, as our event is talking about 1944 this year, I guess we should probably at least mention this event that happened early June 1944, probably around the 6th, Dede, right?
I know a little about
Yeah.
that one too.
The Day of Days.
Day of Days,
so
I called it.
You've depicted it in 2 series with Band of Brothers and Masters of the Air.
I wanted the Masters of the Air one to be different. That was not my first
Oh,
choice, but that's okay. Like I said, it happens.
Well, I mean, let's talk maybe about the Band of Brothers episode with that. What was that process like of taking something so famous and so legendary as Dede and
Dede, but not Breakcore Man. Nobody knew.
But you're finding the way to include this story into it. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because it was 1998, I think, when I got the job, and it's way before the internet exists, really. And Saving Private Ryan, I think, was only like 2 years earlier. And I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember, before Saving Private Ryan, like World War II movies were just in a different category. And then Saving Private Ryan, they were kind of like has-been, people didn't make them anymore. And then Spielberg makes Saving Private Ryan, and the D-Day, 20 minutes of the opening D-Day changed cinema history and changed our relationship to the war in a lot of ways. And so my task was, to try to figure out how to show D-Day in an exciting way that has nothing to do with Tom Hanks and, Higgins boats. Luckily, obviously, Dick Winters had one of the most phenomenal 24 hours that an American soldier has ever had. Among them, Sledge as well. Obviously, he has his stories too, but it's that kind of level of, oh my gosh. I mean, I always just sort of say, listen, the guy drops into Nazi-occupied France in the middle of the night, armed with nothing but a buck knife, and by the end of the day, he's captured and destroyed 4 German cannons shooting on Utah Beach.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bonkers.
Dick Winters, who actually was part of one of our World War II weekends years and years ago, back in the 90s. So it's nice to be talking about him here today.
Yeah.
Well, let's shift back to Masters for a moment here. A big part of the show takes place at a POW camp, Stalag Luft 3. Tell us a little bit about the challenges of writing those storylines.
Well, the Stalag was a challenge. I went way deep in the research. I didn't really answer your research question because I did just crazy research. It was really intense. 30, 40 books, and because again, suddenly now I have to know everything about the Stalag, and it's actually true. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we chose the story, that what happens with Buck and Bucky really happened. Buck was shot down. Bucky did want to avenge it, comes back from London, gets shot down 2 days later, and they end up not just in the same POW camp, they end up in the same barracks. You can't make that up as a writer. You probably wouldn't believe it if I did. But they did. They ended up in the same barracks. I actually discovered in my own research that Clevin was part of, they call it the chicken coop, but he was part of the radio underground that's also true in the show, that Buck was getting the BBC on a handmade radio in the Stalag. But I actually discovered that. Nobody knew he had been doing that until I figured that out. It's just a whole nother layer of world that I had to learn, and then play with the fact that that's where the Great Escape happened.
Yeah.
But it did not happen with our guys because they were in the American compound, not the British compound. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of show the escape from the perspective of the guys who don't go on it, basically.
Yeah. Well, and that also, I mean, so many things about the show, whether it's all these details of daily life in the camp or life on base, all these various connections and stories. One of those stories that is brought in later in the series is these connections they have with Tuskegee Airmen in the camp. Why was that so important to include?
Well, it was really interesting to me that, so in August of '44, the Tuskegee guys start to get shot down, and they end up at Stalag Luft 3. And, they've lived in a country, I mean, I don't have to tell you. And so what does that feel like when these black heroes show up at this Stalag filled with only white people in a society that, is not ready for that? And I thought that would be really, really interesting to explore. Plus it gave us a chance in these trilogies to, share as much as we could of the African-American experience in war. It's hard to do because, these groups were segregated,
Absolutely, yeah. It's essential for broadening out this story here.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a obviously in all of the shows we would have. It's just hard to do, in an organic way, and this led us down a somewhat organic path to share that experience too.
Well, on the broader sense, this show depicting this unique thing in the history of warfare with these technologies, with the Norden bomb sight and all this developed during the Second World War, and within 10, 15 years, or not even that long afterwards, we're moving into different eras of aerial warfare and things. The depictions of fighting in the frigid cold, the high casualty rates, all of this. When you look at it from a broader sense, having spent 10 years of your life working on this, was the strategic bombing campaign, was what these guys did. How do you assess all of that?
I have totally abstained from that conversation because I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think it's up to me to say whether I think it worked or whether, you know, I don't have any issues with it. You know, I know there are people who feel that the Americans were immoral by bombing, but it's really, there's a lot of interesting stories about it. So in 1943, we would only target military bases outside of a city, period. The Brits were already indiscriminately bombing anywhere in the city, and obviously the Germans had been doing that since before the war, right? In the Spanish Civil War, they were the first country to bomb civilians in the Spanish Civil War and in World War II, when they bombed Rotterdam and then London. So the Americans didn't target any cities until actually the Munster mission of October 10th, 1943, which we show in the show. And I don't know if you noticed, some of the guys are like, wait a minute, we don't want to bomb the middle of Munster. That's not what we do. And there was actually a lot of complaints about that very mission that went further up the chain of command, because that mission was the first time the target was in the middle of a village, or a city, sorry, a city. And, you know, then it becomes a much more complicated, I mean, it was a military target, it was a railway, but it was in the middle of town and there were civilian deaths. I don't know how to respond.
Okay.
I don't have an issue with it.
Okay. Well, I think, and last question I have, and then we're going to give folks a chance to ask some questions as well, is I want to ask a little bit about including the ground crew guys in this.
Yeah.
And what were some of the resources that you used for material for that?
Yeah, so what happened was, I think the story of Lemons in the wheel well is in Don's book, I think. It must be. I don't know. Maybe it's not. I don't know. But Don mentions Ken Lemons, who was a staff sergeant in charge of 6 airplanes mechanically, and he was 19 years old. And he'd never gone to school. He was a farmer. Like he could be a mechanic because he'd been on a farm like this and had worked on tractors his whole life. Yeah. And so then he became a mechanic, and he wrote a book. That is key to getting your story told. He wrote a book. And Don Miller read that book and mentioned him in his book. And then I got a copy of that book and read Ken's book and then put in a whole bunch of stuff from Ken's book because I thought it would be really, really important. This wasn't just about pilots, you know, it wasn't just about the swashbucklers and, you know, it's about the grunts on the ground. And you know, they had a really, you know, they were working 24 hours a day. They didn't stay in their huts. They tended to build a tent right on the hard stand that they were working on, and they would live there rather than in their tents or in their actual Nissan hut, because they just were needed on call all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think I have a microphone here. If we have folks who have questions, I will get it to you. I'm going to start right here.
Hey, I love the show. The biggest question I had after watching it was why 9 episodes and not 10? Because I wanted so badly to see a 10th episode
You
about
and me both.
what happened to these guys after the war.
Money.
Okay.
Money.
Easy answer.
It was an incredibly expensive show. Crazy expensive. And we ran out of money. Like, I mean, you know, there was a certain point where we said, oh my God, we are going to have to combine episodes 9 and 10 into one episode because we were running out of money. You know, there is a, you know, I was just mentioning to somebody else earlier, you know, there were things that you just we had a lot of money, but it wasn't infinite. And you do have to make choices. And like, for example, if you're a real B-17 nut, you will notice that all of our B-17s are the B-17F model. And those were slowly replaced by the G model, which looked slightly different. It had a chin turret mounted under the nose, and it looks a little different than the ones in our show. But we we didn't have enough money to change them out and put in chin turrets on 1,000 airplanes. So, we are stuck with financial realities just like anybody else. And so 9 episodes, not 10.
Next question right here.
Hi, this really isn't so much a question as it is a thank you. As you can tell, I'm a reenactor.
Yeah.
Been portraying Army Air Forces since I was 16.
I love your
And
hat.
thank you.
Crush cap.
Yep. Over the years, I've become friends with many 8th Air Force veterans. I'm a member of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation.
Oh,
I
wow.
became close friends with many of the remaining 100th veterans.
Yeah.
And while I was learning
Clint Culpepper, right? Clint?
Yeah,
Chip, thank you.
But while I was learning to fly and getting my pilot's license, several of the 100th vets who were pilots would send me
wow.
messages, giving me tips,
Oh, that's
advice.
great.
One of them, John Clark, he was a 100th pilot. He just passed away
Yeah, I
a
saw.
month ago. He was
Yeah.
He would always send me tips when I was learning to fly. Always fly in the middle of the air was a common thing he would say.
It's good to, that's a good one.
But over years, they would just become heroes of mine. And it was always odd, a 21-year-old kid being friends with 95-year-old men. But thank you for telling and writing their stories and
Thank you very
telling
much.
it to the public. I really appreciate it. And I teared up several times while watching the show.
Oh, thanks.
So I just wanted to say thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Hi. So on that, I have a question. You kind of mentioned this already, but can you expand on the fact with the World War II generation leaving us, how do you feel that
yeah.
you are the outlet for a majority of
Yeah.
Americans to engage with the Second World War and
Yeah.
what that means
That's intense.
legacy? Yeah.
It's intense. It's intense just losing these guys, I get a little emotional. And making one of these shows is a real obligation, right? There's the onus of it, the responsibility of these things are really huge. And there were many, many days where Masters of the Air was really, really hard and really difficult, and I thought about not doing it. But I couldn't not do it, right? Because of my relationship with Dick Winters and Gardner and Malarkey and the guys from Band, and knowing the importance of knowing them and sharing their story and having this opportunity to do it a second time, even though I didn't know the men personally, just the weight of Dick Winters was always in my head, making Masters of the Air. Always. I always was thinking of Dick. Yeah. So, but thank you. I do feel a tremendous responsibility. Particularly the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. has reached out to let me know that just informal polling, just when schools would come to the Holocaust Museum and the docent would say, well, where have you first heard of the Holocaust? The biggest answer is now Band of Brothers. And think about it. One of the interesting things about Band of Brothers, I'm really proud of episode 9, Why We Fight, of Band, because when you sign up to watch Band of Brothers, you have no idea you're going to learn about the Holocaust. So what ends up happening as an audience member is you are sucker punched into learning about the Holocaust, just like these guys were, right? And like, if you decide to watch Schindler's List, you're going to watch the Holocaust, right? Like you've set yourself up like, okay, I'm going to go watch the Holocaust now. When you watch Band of Brothers, you don't do that, right? And yet you are kind of forced to learn about them, the Holocaust, because you've been watching this whole show. I would say to people similarly about the Tuskegee Airmen in Masters of the Air. So many people don't know about the Tuskegee Airmen, and they might not watch a movie about the Tuskegee Airmen, but they watched Masters of the Air, and now they have a whole new understanding of the war that they might not have known otherwise.
So, Mr. Orloff, I want to start by saying thank you. And I'm really trying not to get emotional. I think, we are reenactors. And this was particularly interesting to me for obvious reasons. For 10 years, we waited for this. And then when I saw the trailer and I saw pilots who looked like pilots who I had interviewed, I was excited. I said, how are they going to tie the 332nd Fighter Group into this story? And the beginning of episode 8 said this: while the 8th Air Force was hitting the Germans from bases in England, the 15th Air Force was striking at them from bases in Italy. There were 2 occasions in that episode I came to my feet. I was watching this thing in the bed, and there were 2 moments I had to stand up for the writing of this episode. I didn't know Lieutenant Richard Macon, but I was at his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery.
Oh, wow.
But I was friends with Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson.
Oh, yeah.
And he passed in 2022, and I know he would
yeah.
have been proud to see this episode
Yeah.
and the treatment that you did. And the last thing I want to say, I was a friend of John Clark as well. And we were Facebook friends, and he would write me, and I would make a post about something, and he would encourage me. And one time he corrected me. I think I said ball turret was hydraulic, and he said it was electronic, or it was either the other way around.
Right, yeah.
But he did it in such a way, it wasn't berating. It's like, son, just research it, you'll see it for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And he kept pushing me. He says, now on to major. And I was fine as a captain. And I talked to our commander of our reenactment group. I said, there's this World War II veteran. He said he flew. He's encouraging me to be, And he says, oh, we can make that happen. And I just knew he was a World War II veteran.
Yeah.
But after this, there was a documentary. One of the talking heads was John Clark. I'm like, this guy in the 100th is the person who championed for my promotion.
That's great.
And I tell you that our next meeting, man, I was tearing over. I'm like, look, this guy, thank you so much for writing this story, being true to the story, and being so accurate in everything you did. We all appreciate what you did. Thank you.
I'd like to just sort of add 2 things to that. One, Jefferson has, and I think we use it at the end of the show, his headshot. He is the sexiest looking pilot with his aviator glasses, and it's the one time where the actor isn't as good looking as the real dude. That was, I can't remember what the other thing was, so go on. Oh, this was it. So listen, everybody gets things wrong in these kind of epic giant shows, and we tried very hard not to get things wrong, but I do want to sort of talk about how far we would go to get things right. So, as you probably noticed in that opening scene with the Tuskegees, they're flying P-40s, accurately. Now that meant there's only one scene in all the 9 hours where there's a P-40. Only this one sequence. But that meant we had to create the P-40s in computers. We had to find a real one if we wanted to be next to one. We didn't have to do that. We could have just thrown them in P-51s, because that's what they're famous for. But we didn't, And that's the kind of, quest for detail that these shows allow us to do.
Got another one here.
Thank you for making such an awesome series.
Thank you.
I remember when I first heard about it, it was about 1.5 to 2 years before the first episode, and those were a long 2 years.
For me too.
Yeah, so you said earlier that you would have done the D-Day episode a little bit differently. Can you discuss how you would have done it?
Well, so I wrote these scripts many, many times. So when the show was finally over and I was looking at all my files, I have 500 drafts of different episodes. So you can imagine that means they've changed a lot in various versions. And the early versions of the D-Day episode, there was a whole nother character that existed. Really great guy, Tamarillo, Big Frank. No, that wasn't Big Frank. No, just Frank Tamarillo. Big Frank's a different guy. And Frank Tamarillo was this kind of screw-up pilot, and such a screw-up pilot that they get him off base on this thing that they don't even know they're sending him to, and he comes back, and he's been trained to do the radar. So by 1944, we don't show this in the show because it was just too complicated. So by 1944, we had a very, very crude radar that could look at the surface below. And on D-Day, that's what was used, right? They had navigators, obviously, but they actually had in the lead plane, only the lead plane would have it, the radar. And the lead plane was flown by Rosie on 4 missions on D-Day. And so the first one I had was he's flying, and the guy operating the radar is looking down, and he doesn't see anything, and then all of a sudden he sees thousands of blips, all the ships that are headed towards Normandy. And then the clouds part, and the bombing goes on, and blah, 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 blah. That was the difference. I mean, there's no battle by that point, you know, because the airs were clear.
In both Band of Brothers and the Pacific, I think both were done by HBO.
No. Band of Brothers in the Pacific were both HBO, yeah.
And later they brought out these little tin box sets that you could buy with DVDs.
Yeah.
And I must have watched both of them 20 times, probably
Excellent.
more. Practically have them memorized. I'm just curious, and I think a lot of people in the audience would be curious to know whether this will ever come out in a similar box set.
I honestly don't know. You know, that is, Apple is a different company. You know, they do things differently. Everything about them was a different experience for us too, you know, as filmmakers. It's a different place than HBO. And I honestly don't know. You know, they don't share that with us. I tend to think not, because their business model, you know, is streaming, you know. I don't know. It's possible. Who knows?
So we have, I think, time for one more. There was a hand over here earlier. I want to make sure I get to you.
Hello again.
Yes, me again. Any insights you can share about how the making of this Masters of the Air impacted the actors who are portraying these amazing pilots who expected to die?
I think, you know, anytime you do a show like this, the actors become really, you know, step back a second, you know, most of the movies take like 2 months to shoot, to film, that you're on set. Most TV shows, maybe 4 months. These shows are like 10 months, right? And they're longer. Like a normal television show shoots in a week, like 1 episode, 5 days of shooting, and you're done. These shows, it's 5 or 6 weeks per episode of shooting. So the time that these actors had these people in their creative head is much longer, right? And then on top of it, when you add in the things that they're portraying, I think you'd have to be a really, I don't know, total jerk to not be affected, you know, by these people. I will say this, I don't think the actors in Masters of the Air were quite as connected as the actors in Band of Brothers, because they didn't get to meet them, you know? So Damian Lewis got to know Dick Winters, you know? I mean, Frank John Hughes and Gardner were really close. I mean, really close. So I think that changes things in a way that is not replaceable, right? So, yeah, the actors totally became these guys and totally related to them. I mean, we'll see if they continue to do these kind of shows. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I want to say thank you for joining us today. This was a tremendous conversation. Enjoyed a lot of the comments and our questions here. I think it was a great way as we come to the end or close to the end of our World War II weekend event here and we reflect on, how we keep these stories going forward, how we remember those who fought 80 years ago. And your work with Band of Brothers and now this certainly go a long way towards keeping the memory of these men alive. So I want to say thank you. And we'll present you with one of our challenge coins for the event, titled The Great Crusade. So
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, John, and thank you all of us for attending today.